In this video, we're going to talk about pragmatics. So pragmatics, like semantics, is the study of meaning, but pragmatics goes a bit further by studying language from the point of view of the language users. So it's looking at the language choices that people make and their effect on communication. Pragmatics has sometimes been described as a focus on invisible meaning. So what's actually being conveyed through the words themselves, even though the words themselves might not hold that same meaning. So in that way, it's not just what we say, but it's also how we say it. Pragmatics also looks at how we negotiate social status and relationships, how we assert particular identities or group membership through what we say or what we write. And in the chapter, you also read about this idea of communicative competence, which is an important concept, especially when we're thinking about second language learners, because it's the ability to use language to communicate effectively and appropriately. So that kind of goes beyond just having an understanding of words and how they fit together and how to communicate coherent sentences, but actually to be able to communicate effectively and appropriately is a whole nother level. It requires a more nuanced understanding of what is appropriate in a given context and how you are positioning yourself or being positioned based on the language choices that you're using. So one example of language choices to indicate social status is in Spanish, the distinction between different verb forms, which we don't have in English, but in Spanish and in other Romance languages and other languages, there are different words that you use, verb forms that you use to indicate a more formal tone. So if you're talking to someone, this gives an example here to your parents, to your boss, to the elderly. If you're talking to someone who is of kind of higher status than you, or someone with whom you want to use a more formal register, you use a different verb form altogether. So the more informal form is tú, and the more formal form is usted. And so here's some examples of simple questions that you might ask. How are you? ¿Cómo estás tú? Versus for usted, for somebody of higher status, or for someone you want to be a little bit more formal with, ¿Cómo está usted? So this shows how in some languages, the verbs themselves change to indicate social status. In English, we would typically indicate a relationship difference by the types of the types of words we're using. So you might call someone sir or madam if you're trying to indicate some respect. Or we might make a choice of the specific words we're using when we're asking a question, how formal we make our language. Pragmatics can also, as we mentioned, be used to indicate, our language choices can be used to indicate group membership. So in the reading, Wainwright talks about Jim Gee's notion of discourse, this kind of big D discourse, which he says is how we enact different identities through what we say, through what we do, through what we wear, how we perform different identities and different group memberships. And so the language choices that we make sometimes indicate the groups that we're a part of or that we want to be a part of. So indicate something about our identities. So I'm gonna play just briefly this video of a professional snowboarder explaining some of the language that's used in the snowboarding community. And so those who are members of this community use some of these terms, use some of this language to indicate that they're members of this group. Let's take a listen.
We are going to talk snowboard terminology. We have Craig McMorris here, the best person to talk to this about, because Craig, sometimes you're talking and I don't know what you're saying.
Well, to be honest with you, Jacqueline, I don't know what I'm saying half the time either. I'm just making it up on the fly. No, I'm kidding. The way that you talk about or describe tricks sounds like a different language. I mean, if you didn't know snowboarding, you'd be like, that guy has demons in him and is speaking in tongues, and we need to get rid of those demons. But I'm just saying, very, very universal language to people that snowboard.
Because there are some words like steezy. What does that mean? I have no idea. I never learned that one in school.
I mean, you're not going to learn it in school, but I think steezy, the best way to represent or to describe steezy is somebody that's relaxed, somebody that's got a lot of style. They're very steezy.
How about yard sale?
Yard sale. Okay, that's more in skiing than snowboarding. But what happens is you fall very violently, almost too violently, and you lose product. And what I mean by product, maybe you lose your skis, your poles. Sometimes a yard sale on snowboards when you fall and your goggles and toque and mitts just fly into the air. That's a yard sale.
What about
All right, so I'm going to stop it there. You get the idea, I hope, which is that there's different affinity groups or different groups that use different language. And so part of pragmatics is understanding which language choices are used to indicate membership in these different groups or to index a certain identity. Right. And in the chapter, we also talked about, or Wainwright also talked about pragmatics in terms of culture differences in communication. And he gave the one example, and I'm going to give another one here, that shows that there are differences in how individuals communicate that are cultural, and that sometimes these can contribute to students not being as successful in school when their teachers don't understand the cultural mismatch or the cultural differences that they're encountering. So the one that was referenced in the chapter was Susan Phillips' ethnography, where she looked at communication patterns among students who were growing up on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation. And she found that Indian students who were attending schools with students who were not Indian would often take more time to think through something. Silent, not responding right away was deemed as something that was respectful. And so they'd be less eager to kind of raise their hand and jump in. And as a result, the teachers often thought that they weren't as engaged or they weren't listening. And so tended not to call on them as much because of this difference in how they were communicating, how they were used to communicating with their family and their community. A different and opposite cultural communication pattern is that of many children growing up in Hawaii. Kathy Au is very well known for being one of the first researchers to document something that she called talk story, which is the way that when young Hawaiian children were together, there was a communication pattern that was very normal where they would kind of overlap one another's stories. So one would be talking and sharing something, another one would jump in, and that was a normal communication pattern. And then these students would come to school and their teachers would have them in a group and want to call on them individually one-on-one, or even if in a small group one-on-one while they were talking about a story. And students weren't very animated. They weren't very into the reading exercises at all because it wasn't the way that they were used to engaging with text. And so she worked with teachers and other scholars to shift the way that teachers were engaging with students, to train teachers to actually change the way that they were asking questions and engaging with students, and to create more of a talk story space, which ended up unsurprisingly creating much deeper learning for students, deeper engagement with the text, because they were able to communicate in the ways that they were accustomed to communicating. So pragmatics is also looking at these cultural differences in communication and how that might impact language learners and learning. Pragmatics at school is also important, as noted in the chapter, because sometimes what is said is not exactly what is meant, and second language learners or multilingual learners can sometimes miss the meaning that is actually being conveyed. So the example that Wainwright gives in his chapter is the teacher turning to the multilingual learner and saying, "Why are you still reading and not doing your math?" And the student responds, "I wasn't done with my reading yet." Kind of taking this as a very literal question, whereas the teacher meant, "Stop reading and start doing your math work." So she didn't say that, but that's what the question is getting at. This is one that you may recognize if you are in a classroom or have been working with students, one that I used to do as well. A way to redirect students' attention who are not behaving is to say something like, "I love how Jada is doing such a nice job listening and paying attention right now." Now, while this is designed to say, "Thank you, Jada, for listening," it really is a statement that the rest of the class is supposed to listen to understand that everyone is supposed to stop talking and paying attention, and should be paying attention to the teacher. So these are some of the nuances of pragmatics at school that sometimes may be lost on a student who's still learning English as a new language, who might not understand what's the meaning behind what's being said. All right, so some of the challenges then with pragmatics and second language acquisition: understanding what someone means to say when they don't say it directly, learning how to use different registers, formal and informal. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes those differences are grammatical, so the verb might change. Sometimes it's just the terminology that we use. So learning in each language how to use different registers, different levels of formality. And some ways to address it: explaining what was meant when there is a misunderstanding. So being conscientious of the fact that there might be misunderstandings and being explicit when a misunderstanding occurs about why it may have occurred. And also explicitly teaching how we use language for different levels of formality or for different audiences. So being really intentional, not assuming that everyone will automatically know or understand why we make the language choices that we make. So tying that to conversations about audience. And also teaching figurative language, teaching slang, teaching some of the words that students might encounter, but might need some additional support in making sense of. So that is pragmatics.